Hello there, and welcome to the Value of Everything. So for this podcast, we're going to be looking into immigration. So with immigration, a couple of things to consider. Firstly, you've got the culture clash, the friendships which are bonded, and economics to consider as well. Now the first element, which would be the culture clash, in a fair few countries, particularly say the new countries like Australia, Canada or America, where there probably is, you could say, a fairly strong immigration policy, there's a different type of new age culture which is being formulated. And where you look at Europe, there is more so a deep-rooted culture which has been standing there for some time. Culture may not necessarily be something that's moral. It may be just things that people may do for a certain piece of time, and really it may be moral neutral as well, but it may seem like a waste of time for some people and others. So when somebody assimilates to a different country, they may not take over the cultural customs of one nation to another. When somebody goes into another country, they may not adopt the same cultural customs as the ones that currently reside there. This does create a certain amount of, well, this is the way we do things. Say in the UK, we've got a very strong cultural base of forming a very orderly queue. Now, I would say in most respects that is probably the most moral way in which somebody could be served, as if you don't form a very correct queue, then there is queue jumpers, and that can really annoy people. So we really do have this thing where if somebody jumps into the queue, somebody will say, look, there's a queue formed here, please can you go to the back. Now obviously majority of countries do this, however I would say that there is a very strong cultural bond with forming queues in Britain. Now, trying to adopt something else which is a little bit immoral in terms of Britain is that we have a methodology of batting down people who achieve some kind of a success in their lives. Now, this may not necessarily be something to do with the culture of everybody in the UK, but a lot of journalism is based upon finding dirt on people and bringing them down. And quite contrary to the fact, you do have a nation like America, which does really glorify people's success in a different manner. Now, they do probably pull down people here and there, but there isn't so much of the animosity which is created when somebody is fairly successful over somebody else. There is also an interesting element of class structures which are formed. Now, Indian society has got hereditary class structures. In British society, there is more so of a class structure based upon wealth, occupation, and a little bit to do with the education that you went through as well. And with that, there is a definite difference in the way that people speak from the category of, I would say, more so people that are on benefits, the working class or the middle class. There's a blurred line between those two areas of class that used to be working class, then middle class, which would be like doctors or lawyers. And then in the old days, it used to be aristocracy. Now it seems to be a lot more of a blurred line of this very big working to middle class, because plumbers do seem to earn as much as what, say, particularly an early doctor would earn. And then there is the upper class, which used to be aristocracy, so hereditary wealth, where they would earn land and they would be able to make money from the farmers who would work on that land. But now you have more like a CEO class of people. The people that are at the top of a management board seem to take those high positions and send their kids to the top private schools in the land. So there is a number of cultural things which do occur. Now, culture just defined is just basically people adopting a certain way or certain manner, and then people just using that from that point onwards. There is a moral guidance behind that, and sometimes it's potentially immoral, say for example, when children are circumcised from an early age, where there isn't really necessarily any medical proof to back up this claim. However, it's culturally done, or there is a religious basis behind it. Now, with that, you could in some ways say that culture is an element of religion in itself, because it is a mythology of thinking as to what is going to happen in the afterlife, and this belief of a god. Now, this belief is the right thing to do, and one thing that culture will do is it will try to tap into what are the social norms in society, so that if somebody does anything wrong, then people will stand up, just as I mentioned in my Q example, and say this is incorrect, you should be doing this or the other. I heard in a story recently that there was a child who was listening to Western music in a Muslim country, and he was murdered by the state for that fact, or it could have been for the people. I'm not too entirely sure of full details. It was a quick glance of a news article from my side. However, it's fairly disturbing to hear stories like that because you are seeing two different culture clashes. Now, from this culture element, we're going to just go into the friendship element. This is an important factor, and there's two examples that I think are fairly important to this. Now, say for example that you are holding a house party and you have got, say, 40 guests coming round, so it's a fairly big house party by most stretches. For each one of those guests, as long as they are good people and they are good in social situations, that house party is going to kick off in a very good way. But if you choose to let in one extra guest and that person is fairly aggressive, they stare at people in different ways, they argue with people and they act a little bit shifty, then that obviously can spoil the party somewhat and it can put people's backs up, and there is this little bit more of an element that the party is spoiled by the fly in the ointment. Now, this example can happen again in a bigger scale when you have a bigger country. Now, obviously, people go back to their own homes, they go back to their own communities, and they sort of section themselves off from this matter. But this, in some ways, is a little bit of the problem of isolation when you do have immigration from different countries. It's not to say that somebody may be essentially aggressive, but there is certainly this idea that if somebody's from a different cultural background, then there is more of a chance that you are going to upset that person based upon that person not understanding the cultural norms. Another important part of immigration is the fact that friendships aren't necessarily something that is gained within a matter of minutes, and it really is a situation of a bond which is gained over time and trust is built, and then eventually you do formulate a fairly good relationship, usually based upon common interests. So if you immigrate to another country, and I've got personal experience in this, you are not going to get instant friends straight away. It will take a little bit of time for you to meet up with certain people, for you to be put into a situation to meet others. So if you work majority of your day, then you're really not going to be in a situation where people are going to be meeting up with you all the time. If people are from that nation, they have got friends who they've been with all their lives, and for them to just say, okay, come along to my party, and I've only known you for the last couple of weeks, come round to see all of my mates who I've known for 30 years and you can all get along with each other. It's not necessarily going to happen. And it is very difficult for somebody to assimilate into that group of friends who have known each other for 30 years. You would particularly have to really stick your neck out and be incredibly funny, or have incredible amounts of things to offer in terms of, say, friendship, wisdom, loyalty. You would really have to do a number of things to gain the trust of somebody who has lived there all their lives and have fostered friends. Now, to another certain degree, it will be far easier for you to make friends with other people who have recently immigrated because you are both in the same situation. They probably have got a lot of free time. They probably don't get invited to many social functions. So therefore, you will naturally assimilate to people who have recently immigrated. So from my personal experience, I'm British and I've moved over to Australia. In this example, I do get on well with people who are native to Australia and Australian. Interestingly, I have found that I have gained a lot more closer bonds with people who are Australian who have come from different cultural backgrounds, say from Italian, Armenian, and say Taiwanese. I have really formed much more of a relationship with those kind of people rather than British Australians who have been there for multi-generations. I have got friendships in that respect. However, it's not quite as common. There is friendships that they have had for quite some years. It's very interesting in terms of the second generation people whose families have come from different countries. They're definitely more open and they've got different perspectives on friendships. You definitely get to an extent of when you do have brother and sister loyalty, or brotherly loyalty, or sister loyalty. This is a friendship or a bond which has built over a number of years. There is a number of elements of trust, and essentially it will take a lot for somebody to really get close between those two who would really understand them as much as what those two people would understand. It comes down to that simple logic. Let's move on to the economic side. Now, with economics, you do have this thing called the border. In an economy, there is a benefit system. Now, if there was no benefit system and there was no objection to letting other people into the party, then there wouldn't necessarily be a border. However, in this situation, there is a border and there is a benefit system. So if somebody manages to get past the border, say if they fly in or they use the boat to get through to the land, then essentially once they arrive in that land, then they're going to try to become a citizen of that country, particularly if it does have advantageous benefit systems. So there is an economic advantage from transferring from one country to another, particularly if, say, that they have got certain skills, they've got certain qualifications that could be converted into a higher price bracket. But also this can apply to low-skilled jobs where they can still find that they can earn a decent amount of money and then still transfer it back home. This also includes living on benefits as well, which gives them better welfare of life without having to work at all. If you didn't have the benefit structure in itself, then people passing the borders would essentially have to find work for themselves. This is more so of a case of, say, like a new age United States of America, where people would come over and they would have to find work because there was no benefit system in place for them. So I don't think there would be much of a hostility towards people coming into their country if they essentially had to find work. Now, if they were stealing and using aggression or force to take things for themselves, then that would be a problem for a nation. And this is essentially the fly in the ointment thing, where somebody takes under this cultural phenomenon of thinking that they're better than everybody else and they can steal from everyone and take what they want. That is destructive. So there is another issue as well which is at play, and this is the side of the government. So you have the economics of it. They do have the benefit systems and people can arrive over here. They don't necessarily have to work at all, but you do have the government's vested interest in the fact that they have to have a growing population. They issue an increasing amount of debt so that they get funding to get more votes. So this continuous feedback loop, which is a little bit dangerous because it does create this cultural distrust. It does create this economic leeching effect as well. And essentially, what it's there to do is to keep politicians in power. They get an increased amount of immigration. That immigration will also vote for the more left-wing socialist side governments to come into power, but also as a negative effect, it will increase the population, and that does obviously increase to the gross domestic product, which isn't necessarily the greatest barometer of having a successful life for each individual citizen of the nation. But then this will also add to increased population as well, which doesn't necessarily help to create a good bonded secure community. Now, the example that I'll give here is that if you were in the country and you was in like the woodlands or the country and you saw somebody who had fell over and you knew that you were the only person in that area, then you would go over to that person. Say even if they were 100 meters away, you would definitely walk over to that person. In the majority of situations, I would imagine, you would come to their assistance, you would help them, you would try and pick them up, and you would help them hobble all the way back to the local town. Now, in a situation that, say, you are in the city, you are on the opposite side of the road, you saw somebody face down and there's quite a lot of people just walking past him anyway, you're just walking on the other side of the road and there's a lot of people walking with you as well. It's a different psychological thing that happens. There's a number of factors that come into your head. Firstly, that person could be a mad person, that could be a drunk, that could be a druggie, there could be something dirty or disgusting that has occurred with that person. You're probably quite busy, you've got something a lot more going on with your days, so you don't want to waste your time with dealing with that person. There's a number of factors which could occur that go into your mind, but essentially you will disconnect yourself from the other person's welfare. Now, this is a disconnect of empathy, and this happens when there's bigger populations. The bigger the population, the more of a disconnect of empathy. And also the factor is that you do have a disconnect of people not knowing anybody. People are more anonymous from each other, so there is continuous disconnect which occurs. Obviously, that disconnect is a little bit of a blurred line. Sometimes you could be disconnected from a local country town because you do not take on the customs. Say if you're the only gay person in a local country town, then that can feel extremely isolating. However, if you are in a local country town and they are all good-natured people, then essentially you're going to probably have a very connected, nice, friendship-based area to live in. Also, economically, which we're finding right now, this population growth does add to asset appreciation, and it means that where somebody is young and youthful and you've got your children, there is more of a wealth distribution to the older class who have been around earlier and they've been able to speculate on asset appreciations and they've accumulated all their wealth. However, when their children go out to the open world, they cannot afford to purchase houses because they find themselves in a situation that they've got no real ability to do so. Because of this increasing population growth, which is adding to the asset appreciation, you could say that this is also a little bit more of a catalyst of how the banking sector does enable people to accumulate more of a debt burden upon themselves. But essentially, the more of the population growth, you are going to have more of a speculative spending cycle. Now, here's a very important factor of economics as well when it comes to immigration. If you are a low-skilled migrant coming into the country, then there isn't necessarily much in the way that you can offer that country. And say if you cannot speak in the local tongue, then you potentially will need assistance by the country to have language lessons, maybe reskill yourself. And that potentially is a negative effect for you to assimilate to that country. However, if you come to that country and say, for example, you are fairly prepared to take on failures, you're willing to try something new and you're willing to set up businesses, take risks and start something for yourself, then you do have the possibility or the chance to actually create jobs for yourself. Particularly if you have come from a skilled background, say if you've started up tech firms or you have started up your own factory production lines and you come over to that country and you do the same thing over there, you are a net positive to that country because you are creating a wealth effect over there. So there is a fairly interesting part that if a country was fairly savvy in the way that they were using their immigration policy, firstly, they wouldn't issue too much debt. They'll try and keep a balanced book, but also that if they were trying to immigrate any people to that country, they would be looking at the ones who have the best potential to have a net positive effect. So potentially anybody who's owned businesses before, they would be looked much more favorably in comparison to somebody who was completely non-skilled. Now, let's just look into just a couple of scenarios now to see how, if a government could create an immigrant policy which was necessarily beneficial to society and was good for the citizens of that nation, and was good for just general harmony and everything else. Now, I guess the first thing you would say is that there would necessarily be some kind of cultural connection, cultural ties. Now, I would say probably the most important thing, everyone may go for Western countries like ideals, which would say like a Judeo-Christian or secular, ethical family to come over to that country. But essentially, if you do have people who are good-natured, who are willing to work, not people who are going to leech off the benefit system, who have got a very good temperament. They're not overly aggressive. They're very kind-hearted and good-natured. I would say essentially, if you go back to the house party theory, it's far better to have just nice, decent people coming round that not even really give too much to the party. It's probably better to have them than some really clever, nasty person to come round to your party. So in some ways, for the benefit of society, it's good just to have nice people to come into your society. At least they will look after each other and they will try and do nice things to society. And if anybody else is in that society, then they will really be able to achieve a lot more because good people are behind them. So if there was a way in which people could be detected to find out whether they were good-natured people, then that is probably the most beneficial way of bringing people into a country. Maybe there's a system of which if that person knew a number of people that already existed in that country, then they could tick a certain box. Maybe you could have psychological testing, but that is very risky in itself. But I would say that this is probably more of a standard of which immigration should be put on its lines, rather than somebody who has achieved a number of qualifications and has fit in that skills category, which is beneficial in a way. But when it comes to asylum seekers, which I think probably most people was thinking I'm going on the lines of anyway here, asylum seekers, if they're, say, coming in from a Muslim country, is a lot more of a different situation. Now, if a nation is at war with particularly Muslim nations, then that is dangerous in itself, because there is a certain level of percentage of the immigration which potentially could be an enemy of the state. And they could hold harboured views and aggression, and they potentially could be flies in the ointment of a number of the people who are immigrating with you. And because of them being in their own isolated friendship group, not only for their own reason, but because they are people of that nation, have already formed their own bonds, so that they're not necessarily going to be joining that community itself, there is definitely an issue in terms of a potential enemy which lies within a asylum-seeking group. When it comes to the Muslim faith, there is obviously a positive natured side where there is kindness and virtues which are demonstrated, but there is the warring side of the Muslim faith as well, and the isolating nature of the Muslim faith, which essentially doesn't necessarily want to assimilate and will declare war. So this is the extremist side. In Judeo-Christian values, you very rarely get that side which is appearing. It's more so about love thy neighbour. So there is an element here in which you could potentially say that there is a classification of allowing asylum seekers from a nation which potentially do harbour resentment and has got fanatical or religious dogmas which could go against the state itself and the people of that nation. So here we go to the situation of Europe here. If there was a situation where people were coming into the country and seeking asylum, and there wasn't much of a chance for them to ever really assimilate to that country, they would stick to their own and they wouldn't really culturally mix too much, then you potentially wouldn't necessarily allow asylum to continue for a sustained amount of time. And I would imagine that it will be more beneficial for a nation to allow temporary visas. And you could even go so far as to create a camp for these people. Now, this is fairly controversial, but if you had a camp for asylum seekers and you had some system or methodology for them to work within that camp, earn their own money within that camp, and you were still moral enough to allow them asylum for that period of time, then there would be this ability for that nation to do the moral thing of allowing that person asylum for a temporary period of time. Once the war has completed, then you would be able to send them back to their original nation. However, I'm not sure exactly how majority of the immigrants who come to that nation, how they are able to stay in the nation once the war is over. Now, the obvious one as well here is don't go blowing up places like Syria, as you're going to get a big spill of immigration that comes into your country as a consequence of that. If there wasn't so much of international wars occurring and your actions were a little bit more peaceful as a nation rather than aggressive as a nation, then you wouldn't have the immigration crisis that we do have today. you could just close your borders and say this nation's not taking in any further people. And countries like Macedonia recently has been shutting down. In essence, if you do not allow asylum into that country, then that asylum has to happen or occur somewhere else. Also, you are on the watch of potentially a genocide which could occur, or there could be a mass starvation. Say if you are involved in trying to tackle ISIS and there is a spill of immigration out of that country, no one has got anywhere to go, then it's your plan, if you're going to get involved in that country, to have this plan B for all displacement of people, which is going to occur. Now, if that isn't occurring and you're just trying to tackle the situation of ISIS, but you're not thinking the humanitarian costs which are occurring as a basis of that war, then essentially you are much to blame than the asylum seekers itself. So if a nation were to start a war with another, then there would have to be drawn plans of the displacement of people, the humanitarian effort that had to be laid out beforehand, rather than just blowing up certain towns and areas and then dealing with the consequences afterwards. I think if most people were laid out the terms of how much this war is going to cost them in taxes, how much it's going to cost them in terms of the degradation of society, how much it's going to cost them in terms of the pressure on the public health system, how much it's going to cost them in terms of an overpopulated nation with higher appreciating asset prices in a constant phase where nobody can really get onto the housing ladder, then nobody really would go out of their way to say, yes, I really want to get involved in this war in the first place, which is going to create this displacement of people. Now, there is asylum seekers just based upon natural occurrences as well. Maybe there is water shortages and there is drought, there is famine, and people are trying to get to countries with better infrastructures in place to sustain their own health and livelihood. Now, this becomes even more so problematic because essentially you may not have been the cause of the mass movement of that nation. However, the migrants are coming into your country, and if they do not get into the country, then they will face a grave consequence. Then essentially maybe a country does need to consider things like aid as a very important thing to keep their nation together in terms of keeping its cultural identity together and not to have this ill of a disconnected society. So in essence, a fairly well-mastered country who is managing all their affairs and is not having all of these population spills overs and problems with the immigrants of society and a criminal element. A country really does need to be a little less with an aggressive war tone, and really has a little bit more in terms of a charity budget, just in case there is a humanitarian effort that is required in certain aspects, and potentially needs to have a more of a progressive idea of what is going on in the countries, what are the major risks, not so in particular of just looking at a country's own effort and just walling up the nation and not allowing anybody to come in, but just to taking a view of looking at the nations which are adjoining them and seeing if there are issues with the neighbouring countries and the displacements which can occur. Another thing which is also to consider when it comes to immigration, and this is a fairly obvious one of logistics, is that a nation could just adopt a policy to say, well, really you should go into the next country to allow your asylum. If you are in the UK and somebody from China is trying to seek asylum into the UK, then they say, well, why didn't you try and go to Mongolia instead, because that nation was next door and they would have granted you asylum. Now, the obvious answer here is that there probably is more so of an economic advantage for that person to seek asylum and take the longer distance to that nation. Therefore, a lot of countries should be adopting a policy of asylum seekers should seek the most local country to seek asylum there. And that potentially could resolve a lot of the problems of clashes of cultures. As a country which is fairly close to you, say from Britain, we've got the Irish, we've got the Scottish, we've got the Welsh, we've got the French, who all live fairly close to us. Even though we've probably had quite a few wars with all of them, I wouldn't say that there is, throughout the history, there isn't really much of a major difference between, other than, say, language differences, there isn't really much of a major difference between each one of those people, and they generally have the same-ish views, and there's generally the same cultural mix of people people, which is happening. However, if you take somebody from the Middle East and put them into the UK, now there is pockets of communities from the Middle East in the UK now, but in a general country town where there's only Caucasian white English people, that person is going to have a little bit more of an issue mixing up with those people for a lot of the reasons that I've just mentioned before. So, to just round this off, obviously to have social cohesion, there just needs to be a little bit of time which is granted for people to assimilate. The second generation of migrants to that country usually assimilate pretty well, and once it gets to the third generation, they've fairly well assimilated to that society. There could be certain problems with ghettos and certain areas which get created where there isn't much of a cultural mix which occurs, but essentially that ghetto or that area is created or fostered by new immigration which is coming in, or a benefit culture which is happening as well. So if there is also of nations practicing more of a charitable way of looking and adopting and using preventative measures to stop displacements of people, and if there were less so of a benefit system which is in place and it was just really there for the temporary measure, and there was more so of people looking towards the family for charity rather than the state for charity, then social degradation and the breakdowns of society and the people that feel disconnected, and where you've just got roads which are not built up anymore and there's just traffic everywhere, a lot of these issues would be resolved. However, you would have to go through the first phase, which is to reset the switch of the economic cycle, because every nation has probably acquired too much debt and they really need to start balancing the books, not get themselves in that situation of using more immigration to increase the GDP of the nation. So, thank you very much for your time. If you've got any thoughts, suggestions or views, please comment them below. Obviously, this is a fairly touchy subject at the moment. If you found this podcast interesting, please subscribe below, and I shall be back again for more.